Along a stunningly beautiful stretch of the Snake River sit the ruins of a centuries-old Nez Perce fishing village. Archaeologists discovered something there that concerns just 2 days in May of 1806 and a visit by 3 members of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And as we found out, one house in the village may have served as the first ever bed and breakfast in Hell's Canyon. Even deeper than the Grand Canyon, Hell's Canyon, a harsh place of sheer rock walls.
As you go to the south, it gets narrower and narrower and steeper.
But the canyon is also a bountiful place. The Nez Perce lived here, thrived here for centuries.
We're living within an area that provides you your life. From the water and the fish on up to the top of the ridges, all your food is on the hills.
The Nez Perce had everything they needed, and the Lewis and Clark expedition needed what the Nez Perce had: salmon. On their way back home in May of 1806, the Lewis and Clark expedition camped near Kamei, waiting for the snow to melt in the Bitterroot Mountains. Meriwether Lewis sent Sergeant John Ordway and 2 other men to the Snake River on this route to trade for salmon with the Nez Perce, food needed for their mountain crossing. Ordway wrote about the side trip in his journals.
We passed a large lodge and descended the worst hills we ever saw a road made down.
And their arrival in the village.
At length they invited us in, spread robes for us to sit on, and set a roasted salmon before us and some of their white bread, which they call upa. This lodge is about 100 feet long and 20 feet wide and all in one. And this is the depression of the lodge right in front of us. This is the slope where they probably were waiting while the fish was being prepared.
State archaeologist Dr. Ken Reed with the Idaho State Historical Society headed the project to investigate this site at Cougar Rapids Bar. Using high-tech instruments to look below the surface, Dr. Reed's team mapped the rim of this multi-family home and the hearths, or fireplaces, running down the middle.
This was a hearth here. This is not one here, but this is here.
The lodge, or longhouse, would have looked something like this. Dr. Reed and his team dug small test pits in the hearth and the raised mound on one side of the house and found artifacts whose carbon dates put them in the early 1800s. They found this half of a blue glass bead, 2 brass tacks, and a tiny arrowhead. This evidence, combined with Ordway's journal descriptions of the village,
The rapid that he described is right down there by the Cochrane Islands.
plus other research on the possible routes to the Snake River, make Dr. Reed very confident this is where Ordway and his men stayed 2 nights trading for salmon. And this is crucial. Dr. Reed says they know of Lewis and Clark campsites in Idaho, but nothing remains of them, no physical traces. This is the only place that has a structure associated with it, a footprint left behind.
We did not have until this project any actual sites that we could pinpoint to specific days and specific people of the Lewis and Clark expedition. It's a double pleasure to find an archaeological site that is still pretty much intact in a setting that's intact.
Hell's Canyon, a harsh place, a bountiful place for the Nez Perce hundreds of years ago and for modern-day archaeologists. Despite the importance of the trip to Idaho history, its importance to the Lewis and Clark expedition ended up being pretty minor. That's because most of the 17 salmon the Ordway party traded for spoiled before they got back to the main camp. Archaeologists believe 3 members of the Lewis and Clark expedition spent a couple nights in a house on this Nez Perce village site. Those archaeologists knew the village was pretty big. They just didn't know how big until the Chimney Complex Fire swept through. The signs of an ancient Nez Perce culture can be found all over Hell's Canyon. Petroglyphs decorate rocks along the Snake River.
These are made by using 2 stones, a small chisel stone that would fit in one hand, and then a larger stone, just like a hammer and chisel, and they're packed.
And high up on the canyon walls, pictographs or painted rock art.
This is a small stick figure, fairly well defined.
And long abandoned pit house depressions dot the flat areas.
Pit house was dug with sticks, would have had a framework of Small logs, more sticks, and covered with either mat or hides.
The last 2 years, archaeologists have focused on this depression at a place called Cougar Rapids Bar. A Nez Perce longhouse once stood here.
The longhouse was literally a multi-family unit. It's an apartment house.
They spent the night in the lodge.
A team led by archaeologist Dr. Ken Reed of the Idaho State Historical Society says this is the very spot where 3 members of the Lewis and Clark expedition spent a couple days and nights trading for salmon with the Nez Perce.
We did not have until this project any actual sites that we could pinpoint to specific days and specific people of the Lewis and Clark expedition.
This discovery and the size of the village make the entire site vital to Idaho history. But before this year, tall plants and sharp ones obscured many things.
It's always been under a blackberry canopy full of rattlesnakes.
Then, in the summer of '07, the Chimney Complex Fire sparked. It raged, burning more than 50,000 acres, killing wildlife and livestock that couldn't escape. The flames reached down into the canyon. That huge fire blackened just about everything on this side of Hell's Canyon, the Idaho side in this area. But what it also did was expose some archaeological remnants, like these Nez Perce storage pits that archaeologists just didn't know were here before the fire.
This is at least a storage system, this series of pits. And when you're down here, you can really see there's some depth to them.
Okay, so now turn that, make sure we're still level there.
Central Washington University professor Morris Ubelacher and his students are mapping the village.
We had one area there we'd map 4 winter houses. Well, there's about 20, and you couldn't see them until the grass burned off.
So this is really pretty wonderful because it puts together a bigger and more complete picture of what this whole village site would have been like. Everything it took to survive out here.
For us, this is like a window, a slight window because of that fire. That lets us see things that we'd have never known were here.
Dr. Reed plans to nominate the site as a National Historic Landmark, which will help protect it. But he knows its survival ultimately falls to trusting people to respect the culture and history that saturate the area.
It's a balancing act trying to educate people and protect sites at the same time. I don't think we can responsibly making this knowledge secret, and you can't retrieve the knowledge once it's out of the bottle.
Dr. Reed wants to preserve this link to Lewis and Clark and the entire site intact for the Lewis and Clark Tricentennial. That's still 98 years away. He calls this his short-term goal.